Andy, we're really thankful for your time. Thank you for being with us.
It is great to be with you on the podcast, David. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. Before we start talking about all the exciting things that God has done in and through your ministry, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became a Christian.
Well, gosh, there's a question. So I was raised in a good Baptist home in South London in the 1970s. You, of course, don't have to be a Baptist to go to heaven, David, but why take chances? That's my view. And so, yeah, wonderful Christian home, which laid such a wonderful foundation. But like I think a lot of Christian kids, certainly into my early teens, it was very much my mum and dad's faith, wasn't my faith, kind of thing. And then I got connected with a brilliant Christian youth program called Crusaders. They've now rebranded it. It's now more boring. It's now Urban Saints. But back then, it's Crusaders. And that was brilliant because it was the really first time I think I, really got to think about and hear the Christian faith presented from folks I really respected who were not like my mum and dad or our immediate church circle. And so there were some brilliant kind of youth leaders. And and one of the things they did at Crusaders was excellent youth camps. So we had it was a youth camp on a dark and stormy night, quite literally, in a tent meeting on the cliffs above Hastings on the south coast. That I first heard the gospel kind of preached in a way that just something about it connected that night. And that was the first time I got up and sort of, went forward, traditional, go forward at the front of the tent and give my life to Christ. So that's the kind of moment I date from. And that was the moment really, following Jesus became a thing I had actively chosen to do, not just as doing because that's what mum and dad did. So all traces back to then. So that would have been, I'd have been about 13 or 14. It's one of those things, some people know the date they became Christians. I kind of wish I knew the date. I knew the kind of window. So I was about 13.
Great. So coming from South London, does that make you a Millwall fan, Andy?
Well, no, thankfully not. I grew up around the corner from Plough Lane, which is where Wimbledon FC were in the day, right, yeah. And then later in life lived around the corner from Crystal Palace. So I'm not really a footy fan. I'm more of a cricket person. But if I were a footy fan, it would have to be Wimbledon or Crystal Palace.
You come from the posh part of South London.
Covered in songs and glory, but there we are.
So tell us about the many things that you do for work and why the gospel is always at the core of it all.
Yes, so I have the really exciting privilege of working, David, for an organisation called Solas, which is the Scots word, the Gaelic word that means light, and there's a bit of play on words there. If you know your church history, you've got the five solas of the Reformation kind of thing. And so Solas is an evangelism and an evangelism training ministry based in Dundee, in Scotland, from where we cover the whole of Scotland, actually the whole of the UK, and we really do two things. First thing is we take the gospel out of the four walls of the church and we go to where people are. Because often when churches do evangelism, we kind of expect non-Christians to come to us. And that's okay. Sometimes they do. Sometimes you get them along to Christianity Explored or whatever. But lots of people are never going to darken the doors of a church. So we go where they are. We do events in universities, schools, cafes, curry houses, golf clubs, workplaces, anywhere where we can help Christians or churches organise events like on that territory. And then we do loads of stuff online as well, because now the marketplace is digital as well as physical. And then we teach and train and help equip Christians how to share their faith with their friends at work, at home, at school, in a way that's kind of persuasive, but friendly and engaging and winsome. And so we're a small team. There's me and one half other speaker and an assorted bunch of admin folks who make it all possible, and an amazing bunch of men and women across the country who support us and pray for us and help us do this. It's been interesting 2 years, obviously, with COVID. We're now kind of back on the road again, and just exciting seeing what God does.
Yeah, excellent. You've written a really popular book, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? Yep. How do you answer that?
Well, I'm going to say buy the book, David. I'm going to say. Well, the funny thing is, when I wrote that book, my then 8-year-old daughter just said, "Well, Dad, why have you written a book?" The answer's no. And then it came out, and it was really funny, as I had quite a lot of people on social media repeating the 8-year-old answer of going, "Well, why have you written a book?" The answer's no. And then I had another bunch of people saying, "Well, why have you written a book?" The answer's obviously yes. And so the fact you had these two people who both thought it was a one-word answer. So to be slightly more nuanced, I would say the answer is 85% no and 15% yes, just to be deliberately intriguing. The problem is, David, it depends on how you've got to break the question down. The question, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God, is too broad a question. We break it down into two sub-questions. We ask, does the Quran describe the same God as the God of the Bible? I think the answer is a categorical no. We might press into that as the as the podcast goes on. Categorically not. And that's my specialism. My specialism is the Quran. My PhD was in Quranic theology. But however, if you ask, are some Muslims reaching out for, yearning for, seeking after the God of the Bible? I think the answer is clearly yes. I often meet Muslims who I would describe as being in sort of Acts 17 territory. Remember when Paul is in Athens, wanders around Athens, sees the altar to the unknown God, and he preaches off that, saying to the Athenians, hey, this God who you're worshipping is unknown. Let me tell you it is. And I regularly meet Muslims who I think are almost in Acts 17 territory. They'll tell me, if you ask them about the God they believe in, the God they describe to you is actually closer to the God of the Bible than the God of the Quran. So yeah, the Quran, categorically not the same God. Individual Muslims, it depends on where they're at. And the great thing is God's doing an amazing work among Muslims. I have many friends who have come to faith from Muslim backgrounds.
On a similar theme, do all professing Christians worship the same God?
Whoa, there's a question, and no elephant traps or landmines in that question. Well, obviously, if you're a Baptist, no, let's not go there. I think the interesting thing is, and I press into this in the book, David, is that at the heart of the problem is that people use the word God very lazily. We all assume that we mean the same word. So when Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, says he doesn't believe in God, we think, oh, the God he doesn't believe in is the God of the Bible. Or when Christians talk about God and Muslims talk about God and Hindus talk about God, we all assume we're using the word God the same way. But we're clearly not, because there are vast differences. The first thing I always say when someone says to me they believe in God, I always want to turn the question back to that. I want to ask them the follow-up question. Excellent. Describe the God that you believe in. And there are definitely some Christian theologies where I think the answer to that question would not line up with the Bible. There was an American sociologist a few years ago called Christian Smith, did a really big piece of research looking at the beliefs of, particularly young adults who were, self-professed Christians across North America and Canada. And he concluded after interviewing thousands of young Christians that a lot of what these folks believed in wasn't Christianity. He termed it moral therapeutic deism. They believed in a distant God who was there to make life happy for them, who wouldn't put any demands on them, was effectively closer to being their therapist than being the God of the Bible. And Christian very controversially said that isn't Orthodox Christianity. So I would never dream of coming out and saying, well, this person or that person. That's not for me to make sweeping statements. But I think we can ask the question. So yeah, when you meet someone who's a different background to you as a Christian, it's a great opening question, actually. Say, tell me about your faith. How do you become a Christian? How do you understand God? What's Jesus doing in your life? And if you begin to discern that the answers they're giving are radically different to the kind of ones you would expect, then, press deeper into the conversation and try and draw them back to the scriptures.
Practically, Andy. I mean, that's so good. How do you do that? Somebody who's actively involved with training people in evangelism, if you're speaking to somebody in the street or, in a university somewhere and they say, oh, I don't need to know about that. I'm already a Christian. But as they begin to talk, it becomes aware that they're not describing Jesus for the God of a Bible. What kind of practical tips do you have in terms of challenging that and actually helping them in that situation? Yeah,
good question, David. Well, I'm a great believer in the power of questions, because rather than turn around to someone and say, I don't think you're a Christian, I think obviously ultimately that's not for you or I to judge. That's between them and the Lord. And also, of course, the barriers can go right up. One place actually I first ran into this was engaging with friends who are Catholic, because there are clearly Christians within the Catholic community. It'd be nonsense to say there aren't. I've met amazing people who are following Christ. There's also an awful lot of nominalism. So how do you cut through that? How do you deal with the fact that if you meet someone who's come from a Catholic background, chances are they might not have a saving relationship with Jesus? But you simply go, well, you obviously can't be a Christian. All kinds of problems. So questions are great. So as I say, I've shared a couple straight away. Get them to tell you about the kind of God they believe in. So how do you understand God? Or how did you become a Christian? Or what has Jesus done in your life recently? If they give some answers that you think are a bit wacky, rather than go, I think you're completely wrong, a great follow-up question and say, well, okay, why do you think that? Or I'm just out of interest, as you've read and reflected on the Bible, what are some of the texts in the Bible that you've come across that have led you to that conclusion? And then throw it back to them. And then you see what you can do by, A, you'll get a bit more information. B, you'll be much more persuasive and winsome. C, you're doing what Jesus did. Jesus asked questions all the time. And then, of course, you're also drawing them into the scriptures. And ultimately, what I want to do, whether I'm dealing with a Christian who I think's faith is a bit odd, or I'm dealing with a friend who has no faith, I want to bring them to the foot of Jesus and the cross. I don't want to sit there and just give them a theology lecture. I want them to encounter Jesus. So asking good questions lets you connect someone to the Bible, lets you connect someone to Christ. And as I say, it's what Jesus did. Jesus asked over 300 questions in the Gospels. He actually only answered 8.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Andy. Thank you. Many of our listeners will have heard the gospel shared in a way which tells the person that they just have to believe in Jesus. But that's not quite right, is it? Because Muslims, for example, very much believe in a Jesus, right?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a similar thing, right, to God. If someone says they believe in Jesus, you need to obviously ask the follow-up question, well, what kind of Jesus? Because you're absolutely right. The Quran describes Jesus. The Quran mentions Jesus by name 20 times. There are about 20 times. There are about 90 verses in the Quran that deal with him. But as you read the Quran, you discover that Jesus there is not the Jesus of the Gospels. I mean, firstly, for a couple of reasons. Theologically, of course, I don't believe that the Quran is the word of God in any shape or form. But then just practically, the Quran was written 600 years after the events of Jesus by somebody who lived, almost 1,000 miles from where the action took place. And so, Muhammad, as he preached and taught what became the Quran, would have no conceivable way of knowing what Jesus was like. Very few Christians in Arabia at the time. So no wonder that the Quran has a whole hodgepodge of, secondhand information. So again, we can always ask the question, how do you know? How do you know these things to be true? And I will regularly ask that question of Muslim friends. And Muslims often, fall back on the fact they believe the Quran to be revelation. And then I'll sometimes again ask the follow-up question. So, well, if that's the case, can you help me understand how the Quran doesn't know the most basic details about Jesus? If you only had the Quran, you wouldn't know where Jesus lived, when Jesus lived, what he preached, what he taught, what he did. It's this really skeletal outline of his life with some, in times he looks incredibly Islamic. It looks like someone has sort of taken a few basic bits of information about Jesus and sort of squeezed them into an Islamic frame. So why do you think that is? Would be the question I would ask. And the other question as well with Muslims can be really helpful is actually without getting quite as, because I mean, that, in one sense, that is quite an assertive question. A slightly less assertive question would be to say, hey, I understand the Quran, talks about Jesus, and your Muslim friend will say, yes, that's true. And then you can say, I also understand the Quran says that Jesus taught people. And again, the Quran says this, but it doesn't say what he taught. So that leads to a very easy third question of saying, well, could you share with me, some of the teaching from the Quran that Jesus gave? And if your Muslim friend knows the Quran, there isn't any. Then you can say, well, hey, we have quite a lot of Jesus' teaching in the Gospels. Would you be interested in hearing a story that Jesus taught? Because he primarily taught in stories. And Muslims often really love story as a teaching structure. And then that gives you a great opportunity. And I often begin with something quite safe. I mean, something like the Good Samaritan is a great place to begin. Muslims are often drawn to the theme of justice in that parable, and you'll get them hooked in. It's a great story in the way that Jesus tells it, and you can discuss it. And now you're doing a Bible study with the Muslims. Fantastic. And then in time, you can proceed to other places. Places I love to go with Muslims where I can. Luke 15 is a great place to end up. The story of the father and the two sons, because of course you have the younger son who wants to, rebel and run away, but you have the older son who's very legalistic, if you remember, in the way that he behaves. He's the law-keeping one who's done everything right in his eyes, and has, really upset with the grace that his father has shown to the errant younger brother. And I say the older son in that story looks a bit like a Muslim in some ways, which is not a surprise because Jesus is aiming that story at Pharisees, and Islam is quite Pharisaical. It's you could almost say it's a spiritual descendant of Pharisaism, actually.
Yeah, brilliant. On a similar theme, with all that's going on in the world at the moment, people seem more interested in eschatology more than ever. What are some interesting things to know that Islam teach with regards to Christ's return?
Well, that's a great question, David, because, one of the things the Quran contains hints. The Quran is very fond of dropping little hints, but not giving you the details. And then along comes later Islamic theology and fills the details in. And one of the things the Quran says, it says of Jesus and Mary, his mother, it says that he and his mother will be a sign of the end of the age, or words to that effect, and nothing more. And later Muslim theology came along and kind of backfilled all of this. And this great sort of eschatology grew up in mainstream Orthodox Islam. So most Muslims, not all, because there are different sects and traditions, but most Muslims will have been taught something like this. So at the end of time, as history comes to the end, this figure called the Antichrist, or Al-Dajjal in Arabic, will arise and cause all kinds of chaos in the world scene. And then Jesus will return, fight the Antichrist, kill him, and then break every cross, kill every pig, get married, have children, die, be buried next to Muhammad, and then the general resurrection will come and everyone will rise from the dead. And I always say to Christians, you think our eschatology is complicated. One reason that sort of critical scholars like me of Islam who don't take it as as true would say this arose is the Quran says a number of things about Jesus that you struggle to fit together. So the Quran denies the crucifixion of Jesus. In the 4th chapter, verse 157, it denies that Jesus was crucified. But elsewhere in the Quran, Jesus is reported to have said, "Peace be on the day I was born, the day I die, the day I rise again." And this gave early Muslim scholars a bit of a headache. Well, he didn't die on the cross, therefore the resurrection couldn't have happened. Therefore, how could he die and rise again? And the way all that was sort of fitted together was, I think, the eschatology idea solves that problem for Muslims. Going, well, okay, he's going to come back, then he's going to die, and then he's going to rise again. Although arguably that creates another problem because Muslims believe that Muhammad is the final prophet. And I will sometimes say to my Muslim friends, hang on, do you believe that Jesus is coming back? Yes, we do. Okay, do you believe that Muhammad is the final prophet? Yes, we do. Do you see a contradiction in those two things? Because if Jesus is returning, surely he's the final prophet. And most Muslims have not actually made that connection, which is interesting.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. As Christians, we're so thankful for Christ's work on the cross that paid the penalty for our sin. How do Muslims view sin, and what is the solution for how it will be dealt with for them?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm glad you asked that question. In the book, the Muslims and Christians worship the same God. I say there are 4 questions that are really helpful to discuss with our Muslim friends, or actually friends of any different religion or background, David. And the questions you could ask are, we've covered, what is God like? Do you believe in God, and what's he like? Second question, what are human beings? Third question, what's gone wrong with the world? Fourth question, what's the solution? So Muslims, like Christians, believe in sin, but just as the word God we need to be careful to define, so the word sin we need to define. So if you ask your Muslim friend, do you believe that there's such a thing as sin and that it can affect us, and as human beings we need to struggle against it, they'll tell you yes. If you ask them what sin is, the Quran really, as it sort of explores that question, really would say that sin is forgetfulness. So Allah wants human beings to behave a particular way. He's given laws and commandments in his scriptures. Human beings are weak and forgetful, and so we don't keep God's commands. So God has sent us more commands so we can kind of get it right. And in one sense, Islam really is a kind of moral self-improvement program. Human beings, you haven't done very well. Here are some more commands, try and do a little bit better. The Bible, of course, takes a radically different answer to that, David, doesn't it? And says that sin in the Bible is not really doing naughty things. In one sense, doing bad things is the symptom, but it's not the diagnosis. The diagnosis is that our hearts are actually corrupt. Our very nature has become corrupt through the fall and through our own stupid choices as well, that we consistently try and put something else on the throne of our lives instead of God. In fact, I would say the Bible is very clear that the fundamental problem, I think, when it comes to sin is idolatry. We make something else God in God's place, and that then leads to all these other things. And the Bible, and especially Jesus, are so good, I think, at naming that root issue. And then in terms of the solution, the Bible would, of course, say in numerous places, just trying to do the right thing doesn't work. The problem is not that we don't know the right thing to do. We can't do the right thing. I think that famous passage in Romans 7, where Paul, unpacks what it means to, want to do the right thing, but not have the power to do it. And the amazing promise of the gospel is that we have a rescuer in Jesus who comes, pays the penalty for what we've done, takes that onto himself and deals with it and the death that should follow as the consequence of our sinfulness. But then, the piece we sometimes forget, it's not just the cross, of course, it's in the promise of the Holy Spirit, and that amazing verse in the New Testament where we are promised that if we are in Christ, we are a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. And that process of discipleship is that process of, seeing the Holy Spirit work within us to transform us more and more into the likeness of Christ. My favorite verse, I suppose almost a life verse, actually, some Christian traditions have this kind of idea, Philippians 1 verse 6, he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion in the day of Christ Jesus. Islam has none of that idea. All it has is more and more moral commandments. And I often say to my Muslim friends, Islam's solution to what's gone wrong with humanity is just to throw more of the same things we can't keep with us. In fact, it would be rather like my walking alongside the riverbank, seeing someone drowning in the river and to get the idea in my head that what I should do to help them is throw them a bucket of water. They've got all the water they can handle, quite frankly. What they need is somebody with a rope or a stick to fish them out. And that's the big, I think actually that is another big difference between Islam and Christianity. Christianity would say we need rescue. Islam would say, yeah, we just need some advice.
Yeah, really good. Thank you. We live in this postmodern, post-fact, post-truth world now where truth is championed as subjective. How do you share the gospel to a culture like that?
Oh gosh, it's a challenge, isn't it? Because very much so. We live in an age where, everyone's truth is their truth. I mean, do you remember that Oprah Winfrey interview with Meghan Markle sometime last year when Meghan used those immortal words, well, this is my truth. Yeah. And I think that sums it up beautifully, because I, like many, probably watched that going, bless you, Meghan, truth is truth is truth. Now, what's interesting, David, where I'd start is by saying, look, first thing is, I don't think the world is as postmodern as we think it is. People are postmodern and post-truth and relativistic around some things, absolutely, but other things they absolutely aren't. If you were to get onto an aeroplane and as the pilot sort of taxis out towards the runway, the pilot announces over the tannoy, I don't actually believe in the laws of aviation and physics. I think that's all sort of white supremacy and patriarchy, and I'm going to invent my own truth as we fly to Toronto. You'd be running for the emergency exits. Everybody would. When you go and see a doctor, if your doctor says, well, you've got this terrible medical condition that's going to kill you, but I wouldn't dare tell you what drugs to take. That would be so arrogant. You need to invent your own truth. In fact, come around to my side of the desk. Here's my medicine cupboard. You take the drugs that you like the look of, and I'll write you a prescription. Again, we wouldn't go, what a progressive doctor. We would say, are you insane? You're an absolutely insane woman. Write me the prescription. So it's only in certain areas we've gone wobbly. We've gone wobbly when it comes to morality. We've gone wobbly when it comes to spirituality. And I think for a couple of reasons. I think firstly, we've disconnected those categories from truth. And actually the church has not always helped. I think we've privatized religious faith as we've gone back through Western history. And people have got this idea that, spirituality and religion and faith are just a private matter. And I think we need to refight that battle. And then I think also people have become scared of people, acting in the name of power or truth or whatever, oppressing and bullying others and weaponizing theology and weaponizing morality. And often I think when you talk to people and listen as to why they might say that, they're afraid of authority. We as a society we don't trust people in authority anymore. And lastly, I'd say also, I think people have also collapsed spirituality into morality. A lot of people think that being religious is about trying to be a good person, like Islam. So if you say, well, I have the religious truth, that gets translated into, oh, you think you're holier than everybody else, don't you? And I will often find, if I'm talking to people like that, again, there's so much diagnosis work and listening and conversation, but I want to get to the root of that. One question I've learned to ask people is, what do you think being religious is all about? And they'll often say it's about being good. And if you get anything like that answer thrown at you, to turn around and say, what if real religion, what if true faith has very little to do with being good? And of course, that gets you straight into Jesus and the Pharisees, because that gives you a connection to say, this conversation reminds me of something Jesus did. Did you know that Jesus spent most of his time critiquing the moral religious types of the day? And you often have people go, what, really? Oh, shall I show you? And now you're into the Gospels. So that's the kind of way in to the conversation. And you can have some fun actually teasing people if you come across people who are real relativists. One of my favourite stories, I had a friend of mine who was talking to, who was a high school student and was talking to a fellow student and would always run into this moral relativism and get really stuck. And she tried everything. My friend even tried playing the Hitler card of going, well, surely you'd accept that what Hitler did was absolutely wrong. And her friend went, well, I'm not sure even then I could say that's absolutely wrong, which is amazingly consistent. So then my friend had the brainwave of, while they were talking, her fellow classmate had like a nice sort of Starbucks on her desk that she bought. So my friend reached over mid-conversation and grabbed the coffee and started drinking it. So my friend went, well, I'm taking your coffee. Well, what do you mean you're taking my coffee? Well, you've convinced me that what's good for you is not good for me and vice versa. So I think it's okay to steal people's coffee. I'm sure you wouldn't tell me that's wrong. Very quickly, that went into give me my coffee back, which my friend went, I think we might have discovered a moral truth, don't you? I think we've agreed that stealing coffee is wrong. Let's start from there.
Yeah, excellent. What are some of the biggest issues concerning Christianity right now, and how can Christians best prepare for them?
Well, I think there's a brilliant book actually written by a friend of mine in Australia that came out last year called Being the Bad Guys, written by a guy called Stephen McAlpine. And I think Stephen's book nails it, because I think we have shifted, David, from an age in which people's biggest beef with Christianity was what you believe isn't true. So you think back to 2006 when the so-called new atheism began, and we had people like Richard Dawkins and Chris Hitchens and others. That was their basic idea. You know, you Christians are nuts. Religion isn't true. Now that is not the biggest question, I think, or the biggest objection I hear on university campuses. I've just come off a season of doing university ministry, so I've got, you know, university students' questions sloshing around my head. A lot of the objections I heard, and actually, fun enough, there's not as many objections as you might think. I think a lot of today's young adults know nothing about Christianity, so they're genuinely intrigued. But if they do know anything about Christianity, the thing that puts them off is they think we are the bad guys because of what we believe about sexuality, because of what we believe about the environment, because of what we believe about transgender. You know, you guys are the bad guys. And in Stephen's book, he starts by saying, as Christians, we tend to think, hey, we're the good guys, riding into town on the horses, you know, solve the problem, put right all the problems of the world. He said, we need to realize that in the world's eyes, we're the bad guys now, and figure out what it means to evangelism from that position. And one thing I think that means is we need to work extra hard on being winsome in how we engage people. I think sometimes as Christians, because we believe, you know, we have the sword of truth and, you know, we care about truth. Of course we do. We stand on these things, that we sort of go in thinking, well, if I have the best arguments and shout the loudest and I'm like really verbally persuasive, I can browbeat this person into the gospel. Now that's never worked, but in today's age, it definitely doesn't work, because even your whole manner comes across as you are arrogant, and people have been taught to go, well, I just run a mile at that. So I think somehow we need to discover that way of Christ again. And of course, Christ had this amazing way of being gentle and engaging and winsome, but never compromising. And one of the things that struck me when you read the Gospels, the thing that consistently strikes me, especially in today's age actually, is that the people who were the moral outcasts in the society of his day were the ones who came to him. They came to him. They sought him out. And the religious elites and the religious people wanted nothing to do with him. I worry today in some parts of the church if that pattern's been reversed. So, you know, we do very well attracting the religious types, but the people who don't, you know, fit the moral code don't come anywhere near our doors. And somehow I think we've got to reverse that. And how do we learn to be communities where all are welcome? Jesus welcomed all, and we need to be doing that in the church. Doesn't mean we say we approve of everything, we affirm everything, but to create communities where it doesn't matter what your lifestyle is and how you're living and what you believe, you are welcome to come. And so there is something here kind of for you, and that's going to take quite a bit of rethinking, I think. But all the seeds for that, all the foundation for that is totally there in the Gospels.
Yeah. What are some of the gospel mistakes people can make when sharing it with someone?
Gosh, there's a question. We've assumed we've talked about a few things, I think, already, David. I think assuming that we're all using words the same way in the conversation can be an obvious one. I think not realizing how little Christian information the person you're talking to might have. You know, a lot of the way we present the gospel in the church was, we learned those methods in a context where most of the people we were speaking to had some Christian contact growing up. I'm an old fogey. I turned 50 this year, but you know, anybody, you know, my generation and probably the generation before, probably when you went to school, there'd have been a Christian thought for the day. There might have been a hymn or something. There'd have been some Christian content there. Now I meet people who've had nothing. I mean, literally nothing. I come across people that you couldn't even tell what Easter is, and that boggles our mind. How can somebody? But that's the case, and so we can assume nothing. So I think we can assume too much. Now, what encourages me, by the way, I don't want people to get discouraged. Think about the context of the Book of Acts. You know, the early church explodes onto the scene in a setting where that's the default position. Apart from, you know, the Jewish community there in Israel, once Christianity gets out of the Greco-Roman world, you know, the first Christians are evangelizing to people who know nothing, quite literally, absolutely nothing, and the gospel takes off like wildfire. So we know that the gospel has a track record. We believe the gospel works everywhere, but we know that the gospel has a track record in a kind of society like ours. But I think we may need to rethink some things. Go back to first principles. Go back to the scriptures. So I think there's that piece. And then I suppose one last thing I'd add. There's so many things I might say here, David. The other thing I think is that we don't make time for people. We can fill our lives up so much that we can be so busy at church, doing things at church and spending time with our Christian friends and reading Christian books and absorbing content and all this other stuff. We don't actually engage with people. And I remember a pastor friend saying this to me recently, that, you know, he'd realized that they were getting sort of diminishing returns on their, you know, Christianity Explored course, and they did some digging into it and, you know, did a little bit of work on, you know, finding out how many non-Christian friends the average person in church had. He was horrified that, you know, huge numbers of people in the church, the answer was zero. They didn't have any non-Christian friends. And so no wonder when you then say, hey, what about inviting your friends to Christianity Explored or whatever? Well, there's no one to invite. And so I think one of the mistakes we make is not building those relationships. And one very easy way to do that actually is hospitality. So if you've got non-Christian colleagues, invite them around for a meal, take them out for lunch. You've got non-Christian neighbours, invite your neighbours around for dinner with no agenda to start with. Your agenda is build friendships and you know, open your lives up to people. Eating food together is so good because it's you know, just such a great bridge builder. And then that will begin to give you relationships into which you can sow the gospel. So that would be another thing we need to work on too.
Yeah. You've got the bombshell that you've turned 50 this year, Andy, and I know a lot of people are going to struggle to believe that. But knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to a young Andy Bannister just starting out in ministry?
Don't wear that pale-coloured shirt. It makes you look like a startled badger. No, aside from that, there's a good question. Well, actually, I'll go further back, actually, to be slightly cheeky, David, is that before I went into ministry, and I've just finished the next book, which is called How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot, and that will, God willing, come out next Easter. And in the first chapter of that book, I told the story that my first 5 or 6 years was in the secular workplace. And in the secular workplace, I was an undercover Christian. I kept my faith, you know, I kept my light under a bowl and the bowl inside a box and the box under the bed, because I was terrified of sharing my faith. And one of the things I would love to do, if I had a time machine, I would love to go back to that 20-something guy working at the hospital where I worked in hospital administration, and just share some of what I've now kind of learned about ways to have conversations. So I look back and go, I wish I had a bit more confidence. I wish I had a few more ways to approach things, rather than thinking, you know, my model of evangelism was you go up to a colleague and go, so do you know Jesus? Which didn't really work. So there's that. Then when I got into ministry, so I got into ministry in my mid to late 20s, initially youth work and doing schools work. And trust me, if you can communicate something of the gospel in 5 minutes flat to 1,000 11 to 18-year-olds on a Monday morning, all of who don't want to listen to you, you learn very quickly. I think what I would like to tell my sort of 26 or 7-year-old self going into ministry is, what's the best way of phrasing it? To not compare yourself to others, but to bloom where you're planted. Because I think we live in an age where we're in ministry, we do tend to, if we're pastors, we look at what the church down the road is going, well, are they growing twice as fast as we are? Or if you're in my kind of ministry, there's a temptation to look at other people doing itinerant ministry and go, oh man, everything's happening amazing for that guy, what's going on here? Rather than go, what God calls all of us to do is to be faithful where he's placed us. And the great thing with that, when you get that into your head, David, that isn't just advice for those of us in ministry. That's also advice for those of us in the workplace. You know, I know Christians who are in workplaces who I think, you know, really would love to be in ministry. I have friends who are in the workplace who would love to be pastors and things. And I'll often say to people, don't wish for that. Just, you know, bloom where you're planted. Look at where God has placed you and think through and pray through, how can I be faithful? How can I be salt and light there? And that takes a lot of the pressure off. Because when you're young and in ministry, you sort of can get into your head that it's your job to change the world. And I probably almost burned myself out in the first few years. I've now learned to calm down a little bit.
Yeah. Talking about burnout, because you're very busy doing lots of things, you mentioned you've just written a new book. How do you protect your own personal study and time with the Lord, and also protect yourself from burnout?
Oh gosh, there's a question. There's a brilliant question. So I'd say, firstly, how do I answer this? I think I'd begin by saying, having really good Christian kind of friends around you who can ask you challenging questions. So make sure you have, whatever stage in ministry you have mentors who can help you work through some of this stuff. And I've had wonderful kind of men in my life who've helped do that. I still do. I have a couple of good mentors who are good at asking those kind of questions. That's the first thing. Secondly, set the big level priorities, I think, is important. So I think, for me, and I'm not saying I get this right all the time, I try and make my priorities, David, obviously, Jesus first, then family, not ministry. so many Christians, I think I see sacrificing family on the altar of ministry, and that's not godly, because, you know, the first thing that God has called me to be after a follower of Christ is to be a husband and a father. And I'm not giving the time into my family. There's something gone wrong. And that helps put some of the other things in practice. I think kids is wonderful, actually, because my kids don't have a lot of time for ministry. So if we carry this on beyond 4:30, my 6-year-old will be crashing through the door because I promised to read him, you know, the next chapter of his book, and he won't care that I'm podcasting. And that's good. That's absolutely right. So get those big level priorities: God, family, and then ministry. Thirdly, I think ties into the answer I gave moments ago. Realize that it's not your job to change the world forever. You're not going to do it. God is forever planting his, bearing his workmen and raising up new ones. And so that takes a bit of pressure off. You haven't got to work every hour that God sends, because it's not as if you're going to save the whole of the human race through doing that. Sometimes behind overwork can lie overconfidence, actually, almost as a sense that you are so important that you need to work, 100 hours a week, because if you don't, what will God do? And the Lord's looking up there going, actually, mate, you could do 50 hours a week. I can work perfectly well without you. And then I think, lastly, I'd just say, this is just very practical and down to earth, good time management, I think, helps. I'm really grateful, actually, that I went through the secular workplace before the Christian environment, because I learned really good time management skills there. And so I just structure my diary kind of well. I carve time out for reading and writing. I have a brilliant assistant who really helps me now keep my diary under control. But keeping the diary under control is the thing. Knowing when to say no as well actually flows out of that. Again, as Christians, we can sometimes feel, well, if I don't say yes to everything, then somehow people aren't going to like me. And I think it can be important, to protect what you're doing, protect your family, and protect your walk before the Lord. And then I keep saying one last thing, actually, because I think out loud as I go. The other thing I think I learned late in life, and I wish I'd learned earlier, is realizing there are also seasons and rhythms. So, I had a particular kind of rhythm of spirituality when I did my quiet time and that stuff mapped out. And then kids came along. My kids are 9 and 6. And I tried to squeeze family and that rhythm together, and it didn't work. And I felt very guilty that I was only managing to spend, have a sort of, quiet time sort of 4 days a week at one point. And I had a wonderful friend and pastor who went, there are times and seasons, firstly. So, don't beat yourself up because you're struggling as a young family. Secondly, he said, what about you throw the playbook up, and rather than try and do a quiet time at 11 o'clock in the morning when it's not a good time with family, are there other times of the day? And I actually reorientated my diary. And now my time for spending time with the Lord, for example, is 6 o'clock in the morning. Now the alarm goes off. It's a struggle to get up. I'm not seeing it going, I'm not a morning person, but I get up at 6, I have a strong cup of coffee, I get an hour of peace and quiet, and it works wonderfully. But it sounds obvious, but I had to really discover that lesson of going, actually, work with what you've got rather than some sort of ideal structure. Because you can sit there otherwise in ministry going, oh, woe is me, because I've got to deal with this stuff and I can't do things the way I'd like to, rather than going, again, bloom where you're planted. What has the Lord given you? What can you do? And then trust the Lord to work with that. So I hope some of that helps. I was sort of thinking out loud as I answered that.
There's a lot of gold there, Andy. Thank you so much. We've mentioned the word gospel a lot today, Andy. If someone listening wasn't sure what the gospel was, what would you say to them?
Well, first thing I always say, I talk about this a lot when I do evangelism, right? The word gospel is an interesting word, because I think a lot of people think that Christianity is advice or good news or moral teaching and all of those things. But fascinating, when you go right back to the beginning and you look at the word that the first Christians chose for their message about the life-transforming, sort of work of who Jesus is, they didn't choose the word advice or religion or faith or theology. They chose the word gospel. And not many people, of course, know what that word means. And again, this is a classic example of Christians using it and non-Christians going, what? Because we don't really use that word. Few people might say gospel truth, but we don't really use the word gospel in everyday life. So I point out to people, the word gospel means, quite simply, good news. And the great thing about news is really when someone tells you a piece of news, if a best friend of yours bursts through the door and says, well, that's an amazing piece of news. Well, only two things matter. Did it happen? And does it mean what they think it means? And with Christianity, I say those are the key questions, because I think at the heart of the Christian faith, of course, is this message that the God who loves us, solizing, knowing that we were lost and screwed up and far from him, didn't just leave us to sort it out on our own, but steps into history in the person of Jesus to rescue us, win us home, and adopt us into his family. I mean, that's Christianity in a nutshell. But it all boils down to who Jesus is. That's the $64 million question. So that's what I say the gospel is to people. It's the good news. It's the good news that Jesus has come to get us accepted and welcomed and forgiven and into God's family. But that's not some religious idea. That's a piece of news. It's true. It's the best news in history. If it's not happened, it's a load of old cobblers and let's move on. But that's who we need to think about. And of course, by framing it that way, you bring it right back to Jesus. And whenever I'm talking to non-Christians, where I'm always trying to take people, David, is to get them to be reading the Gospels and asking the question as they do so, who does Jesus think he is? And do I believe him? Those are the two crucial questions. And that's the good news in a nutshell.
Yeah. What is the best way for people to keep up to date with you, and how can people be praying for you, Andy?
Thanks for asking that, David. So keeping up with us is fairly easy. If you Google me, you'll find me on social media and everything, bung me into Facebook, or you can find Solas as the other thing. So SOLAS is Solas. Our website is solas-cpc.org. Maybe you'll be very kind and put a link in the show notes. And on the website, Solas, you'll find thousands of resources, videos, articles, whatever. There's material for sharing non-Christian friends, stuff to get you equipped in evangelism, loads of stuff. And the main thing to say is it's all free to use. You don't have to ask our permission. I always get a bit depressed when someone feels the need to email me, say, hey, can I borrow that video? Use it. It's there as a resource to others. So they can find me and the team there. And in terms of praying for us, I think the main thing I would ask for prayer for, David, obviously we're coming out of COVID now, so we're getting back on the road and getting in front of, just amazing audiences. So just to really appreciate prayer that when we're speaking to non-Christians, God would just give us grace and persuasiveness and winsomeness. We'd love to be winsome so we can win some. One of my friends likes to put it. And so just pray that God would anoint us that way. And then when we're talking to Christian audiences, or just value people's prayers, that we can really equip people to be confident in sharing their faith with their friends. I get excited when you think about all the places that Christians are. One thing I'll often say to pastors when I'm teaching and training is, sometimes we can think, about our churches in a very small way. Oh, we've only got, 90 people coming and, we're making minimal impact in the community. And one exercise I'll often do with pastors is say, well, make a list of everywhere that someone in your congregation is Monday through Saturday. There'll be students in schools and universities, there are people in workplaces, and think about that as the place that your church is influencing. And now part of your job as a pastor, and Solas loves helping people do this, is to equip those in your church so they can share the love of Christ into those places. It gives a much bigger vision of what the church is. So we value people's prayers, that we can continue to do that effectively and serve God's people well.
Wonderful. Well, Andy, we will make sure that there are links to your website and to your social media, and also to your books in the description below. So wherever you're listening to this or watching, make sure that you check those out. Andy, thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed speaking to you today.
It's been a pleasure, David. Thanks for having me on the podcast.